so much for joining us today for a discussion on COVID-19 policy decisions, vaccine mandates, and how to prepare your business. My name is Andy Johnston, and I have the honor of serving as the Vice President of Government Affairs for your Grand Rapids Chamber. As advocates for the West Michigan business community, it's the Grand Rapids Chamber's goal to equip you with the most relevant information to help you make the best decisions for you, your team, and your customers. As we continue to navigate the unpredictable twists and turns of COVID-19, the Chamber is here to help you and your business make the best of these challenges while working to protect both lives and livelihoods. Over the past year and a half, we've helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of businesses, literally, with questions about what's coming next, how to comply with different guidelines, and we're going to continue to do that. Chantel LaForest is going to send a follow-up after this call with some more resources that are still available for your business, monetary resources that your business may be eligible to qualify for. I'm happy to be joined today by Kristen Guinn of Smith, Haughey, Rice, and Roegge, Chris Heileman of Uccello's Hospitality Group, and Dante Villarreal, the Vice President of Business and Talent Development for the Chamber for this discussion today. With a fourth COVID-19 surge looming in Michigan, which is expected to peak over the coming weeks, there's a lot of questions about what the best policies are, what employers can do, and how to prepare your business. COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations have been inching upward in Michigan for a little more than a month now. However, and thankfully, new deaths tied to the virus have remained low, and vaccinations appear to be protecting many against serious illness. The fight against COVID-19 is clearly not over. If you're already vaccinated, thank you. If you're not, we urge you to protect yourself, your family, and your friends by taking a safe and effective COVID vaccine, whether it's the Made in Michigan Pfizer vaccine or another one. In response to the rise of the Delta variant and other issues, universities, local school districts, regional health systems, and a growing number of corporations have taken action with policies mandating employees and student vaccinations or other requirements for unvaccinated individuals like masks and testing. And while Governor Whitmer and MDHHS Director Elizabeth Hertel currently see the state's role in responding to the pandemic as offering accurate information on how the public can lessen its risks to being infected and how people can get vaccinated, they are not ruling out the possibility of future statewide restrictions, which of course is the Chamber we want to avoid in any way possible. Today, we are going to learn a little bit more about these issues, what they mean to you as a business owner and a leader, and how you can prepare. As questions come up, please submit them through please submit them in the chat throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to get to them with as much time as Q&A allows. And should you experience any technical issues, just send a direct chat to the Grand Rapids Chamber in that chat function. Finally, our webinar would not be possible without the support of our 2021 Government Affairs underwriters. We'd like to thank them with a warm virtual round of applause. We have our advocacy underwriter Amway, advocacy supporters AT&T Michigan, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, and Priority Health. So let's jump right in. First, we are joined by Kristen Guinn, a shareholder at Smith, Haughey, Rice, and Roegge, to hear more about vaccine policy decision-making and the liabilities that may fall on employers and businesses throughout the process. We'll have a short Q&A session with Kristen following her presentation. And again, post those questions in the chat and we'll see if we can get to them. Kristen, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. I'll turn it over to you for some remarks.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate it. And hello, everyone who is able to join us today. As I said, I'm here to talk with you about some of these issues from the employer's perspective. So the big question is always, can my employer mandate vaccinations? And of course, we've heard it so many times now, but of course, the answer is yes. There's been a push to encourage companies to require employees to get vaccinated, excuse me, but there are no Michigan or federal requirements to do so as of today. You have certainly heard about the large national and international companies announcing such mandates. Recently, the Pentagon announced they plan to add the coronavirus vaccine to the US military's list of required shots by mid-September. And some Michigan companies have mandated the vaccine, including Henry Ford Health System, Trinity Health, MSU, U of M, and Wayne State, to name a few. The guidance from the EEOC, and for those who are unsure, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, provides that employers can mandate vaccines for their employees, as long as they comply with provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and an employee's religious freedoms as guaranteed by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Now, all that can be quite overwhelming to some, depending on the size of your business. Under the ADA, an employer who is mandating the vaccine must evaluate whether to accommodate an employee who cannot receive a vaccine due to a medical or disability-related condition. Now, if the answer is yes, the employer must attempt to make reasonable accommodations, such as remote working, as we've seen, before excluding the employee from the workplace. Now, I'm going to use the phrase reasonable accommodation a lot today, but remember that such an accommodation cannot create an undue hardship on the employer. I won't get into what an undue hardship is in this presentation, but for simplicity, it's something that would put excess burden and expense on the employer. Definitely something, if you feel like you're in that situation, to seek some legal advice. Interestingly, under the ADA, an employer may require an individual with a disability to meet what is called a qualification standard applied to all employees, such as a safety-related standard requiring the COVID-19 vaccination. This is so long as the standard is job-related and consistent with business necessity. So if a particular employee cannot meet such a safety-related qualification standard because of a disability, the employer should not require compliance for that employee unless it can demonstrate that the individual would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of the employee or others in the workplace. So let's break that down just a little bit. So for a threat to be considered direct, there must be a significant risk of harm that cannot be reduced or eliminated by a reasonable accommodation. So the EOC lays this out in a two-step analysis. First, whether there is a direct threat, and if there is, then number two, whether a reasonable accommodation would reduce or eliminate it. But how does an employer determine if an employee who is not vaccinated due to a disability poses a direct threat in the workplace? So some factors to assess would include the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. This determination should account for the specific employee's position and the most current CDC recommendations. And I'm not saying this analysis is easy. It's certainly a case-by-case situation, but something to definitely consider if you are dealing with when you have employees who may have a disability. If the employer decides that the employee with a disability poses a direct threat to themselves or others, the employer should determine whether reasonable accommodations would reduce or eliminate the risk. An employer should use this assessment process prior to excluding the employee from the workplace. So as a reminder, inquiries about or requests for documentation regarding an employee's vaccination status is not a disability-related inquiry under the ADA. So instead, it falls under the category of medical information and must be kept confidential. Similar to the requirements under the ADA, under Title VII, an employee who cannot receive the vaccine due to a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance must be given reasonable accommodations unless the accommodation would impose an undue hardship on the employer. I like to remind employees as well not to forget about or treat pregnant employees differently. Pregnant employees who cannot get the vaccine due to a pregnancy-related medical condition may also be entitled to reasonable accommodations. Pregnancy-related medical conditions may themselves be disabilities under the ADA, even though pregnancy itself is not an ADA disability. I know, say that a couple times fast. If an employee makes a request for reasonable accommodations due to a pregnancy-related medical condition, the employer must consider it under the usual ADA rules. As well, Title VII, as amended by the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, specifically requires that women affected by pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions be treated the same as others who are similar in their ability or inability to work. I bring this up because we've seen a lot of what we would call COVID babies. So you may have more pregnant employees now than you may have seen in the past. So what this means is that pregnant employee may be entitled to job modifications, including working remotely, changes to work schedules, and leave to the extent provided for other employees who are similar in their ability or inability to work. After someone asks me about mandated vaccines, usually the next question is about incentives. Instead of a mandatory vaccination policy, an employer may wish to incentivize its employees to receive the vaccine. Such incentives might include additional compensation, bonuses, vacation time, or other PTO. Employers must be mindful of the requirements of ERISA, group health plans, and HIPAA wellness program regulations when considering incentives. They should provide alternative ways to earn those incentives for employees who do not want to receive a vaccine, for example, attending a training or continuing education program. Employers should make sure to create and implement a written policy and adhere to a process for providing reasonable accommodations to employees while applying any applicable state and federal laws regarding employee leave and layoffs. I've also had employers ask me if they have legal exposure for claims based on COVID-19 compliance. Michigan has passed some laws that provide employers immunity from liability for COVID-19 related claims, as long as they are in compliance with COVID-19 related government directives. For example, the COVID-19 Response and Reopening Liability Assurance Act in Michigan provides immunity from liability from COVID-19 tort claims against employers. It applies to those employers who act in compliance with all COVID-19 related government directives. So what this means is that an employer may have immunity under this act from claims related to exposure or potential exposure to COVID-19, or to conduct intended to reduce the transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace. The most important component to this protection is that the employer must be complying with all government directives related to COVID-19. Also, the Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Act, or MIOSHA, was amended to provide immunity from liability for an employee's exposure to COVID-19. Again, assuming the employer is complying with all government directives related to COVID-19. You can see the theme here. Additionally, there's a Michigan statutory provision that protects employees from retaliation, discrimination, like discharge or discipline, if the employee is in compliance with COVID-19 directives contained in the law, or if the employee reports health violations. So for example, if an employee tests positive for COVID-19 and as a result doesn't report to work, the employer cannot discharge, discipline, or retaliate against the employee. Now, I would just make a note that there's a bill that was introduced in July to repeal this act. So we'll see where that one goes. Lastly, although I touched on this earlier, I always like to remind employers that, like other health records, employers must treat vaccination records as medical information and keep the vaccination records in separate confidential files similar to other employee medical information. The bottom line as we counsel employers on navigating COVID-19 related issues is really to make a policy and follow that policy. Talking with an attorney can always be beneficial, not only to make sure your policies are in line with current law, regulations, and guidance, but also to confirm that your employee handbook is consistent with those updated policies. So thank you for your time, and I'm always happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kristen, for the great information. And, Kristen, just a couple of questions. I just want to reiterate, it's okay for the employer to ask for the medical information. They ask for other medical information. And at one point, over the past 18 months, I believe this year even, it was part of the MIOSHA requirement for employers to get and gather the vaccination data. One of the things I'm wondering though is you have to keep that, you said confidential and separated. What can employers do? And we've seen this from some employers, is that they're requiring non-vaccinated employees to either wear a mask or undergo COVID-19 testing. I think Rocket companies said they were going to require that on a weekly basis. Talk about that and any issues that may be created there.
Sure. So an employer is allowed to require a non-vaccinated employee to wear a mask. According to places such as OSHA, an employer can determine if PPE is necessary to protect the unvaccinated or otherwise at-risk workers. And so really it goes to an employer decision. You know, we all remember where there were those directives about what had to be in place in terms of health screening and other types of requirements when you went into your place of employment. For non-health related employers, that has been relaxed. And so it's up to the employer to do so, which means that employer can require it of their employees if they decide that it's necessary or important for their business or whatever reason they might have.
So as we talked about at the beginning of this, we've seen universities, some public institutions, large corporations making some decisions about mandates or other policies. Are we at the beginning of this? I mean, do you see this happening more potentially? What are you seeing other maybe mid-sized, smaller companies doing? Are you getting these questions from other employers?
I am getting these questions from other employers, and it's been kind of a mixed bag. I think I've heard a lot of, we're going to wait and see. But there are some pros in terms of implementing a mandated vaccination policy. Businesses with fewer than 500 employees may be eligible for a tax credit under the American Rescue Plan. And so that may be incentive for an employer to implement a mandated policy. And obviously it really depends on what their clientele are. If you work, for example, with a lot of health related businesses, it may be beneficial for you to be vaccinated because many of them are mandating it, just as an example.
And we've seen some nuanced policies, I think, come out. I mentioned Rocket Mortgage with non-vaccinated individuals, Spectrum Health saying we're going to require it, but we're only going to start requiring it until the FDA fully approves it, which could come in September, it sounds like. Maybe that date's changed, but that was the last I've heard. Are there other alternatives or different levels of mandates that people should think about?
So when I spoke about the incentives, that's kind of an alternative to the mandated policy and different types of incentives. So an employer can decide, hey, I need you to show me your documentation and I will incentivize you with money. It's usually in some form of money, whether it's PTO or additional compensation. But then also, an employer may decide they want to do something on site, kind of like the flu vaccine or the flu shot, where, my employer will have something available to us to make it easy for everybody on site. And so that may become something with the coronavirus vaccination. But again, as I mentioned, if there is an employee who has a valid exemption from the vaccination, it would behoove an employer to provide some sort of incentive for the non-vaccinated employee, similar to what is being provided to those who do receive the vaccine, just to err on the side of caution in terms of avoiding any level of discrimination.
Yeah, I think that was the question. We had that question in the chat. Please cite in the guidelines where you found that an employer must, give an alternative kind of bonus there. And you're saying that's not so much the guidelines, but maybe more in trying to comply with the law.
Yeah, I think to mitigate the risk of discrimination, there should be some alternative method for which an employee can receive an additional, or I guess, alternative incentive. And I would suggest something like it could be a COVID-19 training program or something that is topically related, but that is required for that employee to attend before they also receive some level of PTO.
Getting a couple questions about requesting that employees give you a copy of their vaccination card proving that they're vaccinated. What are acceptable forms of COVID-19 vaccination records? The cards are fairly large, not a lot of people carry them. Can we accept ones that have been shrunken down or manipulated?
That's a very good question. I think most of us have a card, and we've heard about the scams where they are being illegally manufactured, and so I guess it's just to a level of how you trust your employees. You could certainly, you're entitled to request medical information to support your policies such as this. So if you do want to get additional information from your healthcare provider, I'm not 100% certain what form of that would be in terms of a medical record, but there's certainly something that they may want to talk with their legal counsel just to confirm that what they're requesting is appropriate.
I think this is an interesting question. What if someone cannot do their job from home but refuses to be vaccinated and has no medical or religious reason not to? Is that the situation where you might have to part ways if there's an employer mandate then?
If there is an employer mandate and they do not fall within an exemption, then they are subject to termination depending on the terms of the employment contract, if there is any. If they're an at-will employee, that's definitely a situation where there would be termination.
And one issue that's come up, the chamber does on Fridays first Fridays at 10 a.m. we do a quick half-hour government affairs update to hear what's on members' minds. And one of the questions that came up was, hey, I'm a vendor that's serving an employer that has mandated vaccinations. Can they require that the employees that are serving them be vaccinated as well?
That is certainly up to the employer's prerogative that they can, it's a free market, so they can choose which vendor they would like to use. I hate to fall back on it, depends what the contract says, but if there does happen to be a supply agreement with that customer, then you certainly want to look to that to see if there's any guidance, although I have to say it wasn't contemplated in a lot of contract negotiations that we would be in a pandemic. So it may be silent, and that's when you certainly have to make a decision. If you want to get into a fight with your customer over something like that and lose the business, that's a tricky business decision. But that's certainly something that a consumer of services could certainly require.
Kristen, you're getting some good questions here. Another one, if a vaccinated employee asks if there are non-vaccinated employees in their work area, do I have to tell them? And if so, how?
It has to be, you can speak about numbers. So for example, we know that, I'm just making up numbers, we know that 75% of our workforce is vaccinated, but you can't speak specifically about individuals.
Tara has a question, and I think it's following up on the vendor question, and would say, if the employer is mandating vaccinations, would that apply to customers and patients in healthcare as well, or could you extend it to them? I think we've seen some quote unquote that be extended to customers in terms of, I've seen it in concert venues, right? Saying this is for only vaccinated customers, so to speak.
Yeah, again, that would be a business employer decision, especially if it's a private business. They can choose, to a certain extent. Again, I'm going to back up for a second. Being vaccinated or unvaccinated is not a protected class in terms of discrimination. Montana has actually made it so, but Michigan and other states have not, although we'll wait to see what happens as things move forward. So at the moment, there is not a protected class in that regard. But you certainly want to have, again, a policy in place so that you're standing behind something if anyone accuses you of wrongdoing.
Another question in the chat: if we don't require our employees and volunteers to wear masks and a client ends up catching COVID from one of our employees, are we liable for a lawsuit? Employees or volunteers is the question.
That's a good question too. Again, so there, as I mentioned earlier, there is some protection with regard to liability if there is some transmission of the virus at your establishment. And so the government directives have changed over time, and masks are not required in most places anymore. So in that circumstance, as we sit here today, which it could change tomorrow depending on what executive orders come down the pipe, I would say, without knowing all the facts, as a lawyer would say, that there wouldn't necessarily be liability in that instance, unless there was something nefarious going on.
I like this question because I thought about it when the lotteries came out. Does an employer need to reward those who are already vaccinated with equal incentives that are offered to those who are unvaccinated? So, you got your vaccination, but all of a sudden the employer is saying, hey, $50 to anybody who gets vaccinated now. Do I have to make those folks whole?
Again, being vaccinated is not a protected class in terms of discrimination. However, because you want to potentially err on the side of mitigating that risk of discrimination across the board for those who are vaccinated or unvaccinated, you may consider, again, in that instance, they receive maybe some sort of incentive. They shouldn't necessarily be penalized for getting the vaccine early, but I certainly understand the quandary with the different levels of vaccinated employees.
Thank you. No, Kristen, thank you. I think sometimes that's the best answer, because that is the answer. We have a couple more minutes with you. Are mask mandates treated the same as vaccine mandates? Another good question.
It is a good question. And I would say at this point, it's not. It's not the same, but an employer can certainly require that masks be worn, just as an employer can require vaccinations. And
right.
So, we that brings up a good point, because we talk a lot about the vaccines, but the exemptions to a vaccine may also apply in a mask context if there's an issue in terms of a disability or religious belief or something along those lines.
In the case of a at-will employee termination due to non-compliance with the vaccination request or mandate, as the employer, is there any recourse on unemployment if they have to terminate someone due to the vaccine mandate?
I'm sorry, can you say that? I think I missed the beginning part. Are you asking what they could do in terms of if the employee is getting unemployment?
Let's say you require vaccine mandate and the employee decides not to comply. Will that impact your unemployment rating?
Well, it depends how the employment ends. So if the employee quits, that's different than if the employee is fired, and they may be able to obtain some level of unemployment depending on how the termination goes through.
Gotcha. Kristen, the other thing I wonder about is enforcing the exemptions. Is that one of the areas, if an employer decides to go down this path, that's pretty difficult, verifying those exemptions?
That certainly will be the hardest part, and just a difficult thing to navigate. So you're certainly going to want a point person who would be in charge of that process. And again, there needs to be a policy and a process, and everything needs to be the same for every person who is going through that process. But you're certainly entitled to the documentation in the medical records, especially if it's related to some sort of medical condition or disability. You're entitled to have that information so you can assess whether or not an exemption applies.
Well, Kristen, thanks. That does it for our Ask the Lawyer section, the vaccines and vaccine mandates. Truly appreciate it. I do want to thank you also for pointing out the liability issues. Those were some bills that the Grand Rapids Chamber was strongly supporting in the state to try to limit employer liability if they're trying to do the right thing and follow the current guidelines that are out there. So Kristen, thank you. And you did a great job at our healthcare summit this spring. We brought you back on this topic, and we may have to bring you back again in the future. So thanks again.
Happy to do so.
At this point, I want to hand things off to my colleague, Dante Villarreal, our Vice President of Business and Talent Development. He's going to introduce our next speaker and talk more about how business leaders can prepare their businesses while facing new changes and expectations. Dante?
Thank you, Andy and Kristen, for a great start to our program today. Again, my name is Dante Villarreal, and I'm the Vice President of Business and Talent Development here at your Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce. So here we are again, at a point in time of uncertainty and rapidly changing conditions. Although this time around, we know the businesses that will navigate this storm successfully are those that are proactive, informed, and have a game plan. Next, we have one of those businesses who is here to share what they are doing. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Chris Heileman, CEO of Uccello's Hospitality Group. As someone who knows the restaurant and customer service industry inside and out, Chris will be sharing some advice for business owners as to how they can prepare their businesses and respond to the customers in the right manner during these difficult times. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dante. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back on Zoom. I was starting to get some in-person meeting fatigue. So I want to start with just mentioning again my belief in the power of productive paranoia, learning how to take our biggest fears, channeling them into extensive preparation, and then taking calm, clear-headed action. So as far as policy decisions, being a company that runs on EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, has really given us the tools to be best prepared for situations like this. The Delta variant was on our issues list at our quarterly leadership team meeting back on July 29th. And last Thursday, we identified, discussed, and solved this issue at our weekly level 10 operations meeting. And one of the solutions we came up with was to update and reshare our COVID-19 preparedness response plan with our general managers, and to take that down and IDS it at the restaurant level 10 meetings. We really believe in moving the decision-making to where the information is. So we've got to allow the leaders in our organization with the boots on the ground to make key decisions. So having a preparedness and response plan is crucial to communicating the COVID-19 guideline changes to our managers and our team members. It is updated and sent out whenever a new guideline comes out, and is available 24/7 on our Google Drive and team website. Putting adequate time into creating the preparedness response plan is critical. It felt like a huge undertaking while the team worked on it, but we have all referred back to it numerous times, making improvements throughout. Now that we're facing the possibility of mandates returning, we have a solid foundation of policy and experience to lean on and guide us through. We recently updated the FAQ section to include information about vaccinated team members and the Delta variant. So we decided to bring back daily health screenings, including temperature checks at each restaurant by this Thursday. Having one person in charge of keeping up with updates from the Kent County Health Department, MIOSHA, MDHHS, and the CDC is crucial so that you aren't sharing misinformation. And UHG has one person, our Director of Finance and Team Relations, Kayla Schulten, who does amazing work on keeping up to date on changing guidelines, then communicates them to our leadership team at our weekly level 10 meetings, and then makes sure to cascade that information out to our team members. As far as vaccine mandates go, we are not planning on mandating vaccine at UHG. We feel this could cause us to lose valuable team members in a world full of hiring challenges already. But we're strongly encouraging all team members to receive the vaccine. To help encourage them, we've provided all team members with facts on how the vaccine was developed directly from the MDHHS. We also gave all team members a directory of where they could receive the vaccine and how to set up appointments should they choose to do so. And so educating the team with factual information is crucial. Being flexible in their scheduling to allow time for the vaccine and time to recover from side effects was something else that worked for us. Our team felt like they could take time off to get the vaccine or to recover from the side effects. How to respond to customers or guests. When I'm interacting with guests, we, as an organization, always go back to our core values and our core focus, and always just ask the question, what do our core values and core focus tell us we should do, or how we should handle the situation? Our core values are resilient, adaptable, and flexible, grace under fire, create positive change, committed, give more than expected, never compromise on our quality and reputation, hospitality driven. We care for each other, we care for our guests, we care for our community, and we care for our vendors in that particular order. Always seek first to understand, so empathic listening and think win-win. Humbly confident, open, honest, balanced ego, no arrogance, doing good while being good, and do the right thing, trust, respect, and integrity in all of our relationships. So that has seemed to work well for us. And our core focus is creating memorable family experiences and providing great food and hospitality. And one last recommendation I'd like to make would be just to talk with our friends at Health Bar, who help businesses with nearly every aspect of their business, to their back operations, planning and safety related to medical needs. They offer testing, advising, and planning services, all related to COVID. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing your time and experience with us. I applaud your work and how you are navigating the ship in these difficult times. This concludes our program. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today to hear from our excellent speakers. This town hall has been recorded and will be posted on our website in the coming days for attendees and those unable to tune in. As always, our government affairs team, and let me restate that, your government affairs team is here to assist you. We will continue to keep our members up to date through our Catalyst newsletter and social media pages. If you have any questions, please reach out to one of our team members who will be more than happy to connect with you. Before we leave, I would like to extend one final thank you to our gracious sponsors, our advocacy underwriter, Amway, our advocacy supporters, AT&T Michigan, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, and Priority Health. And with that, this concludes today's event. We wish you health and have a wonderful week. Thank you.